Welcome to the PowerLooking, a guide to assessing aesthetic smiles webinar. It is being presented by Arthur Volker, DDS, MSED, FAGD, and we will begin the webinar shortly.
I appreciate and thank you to everyone for joining us. So today, in the next hour or so, I'd like to give you a portion of a program that's done in a little bit of a hands-on, but we have to kind of give you a shortened version of it. It's kind of a course I like to start with when we teach a lot of our anterior courses, be it direct or indirect. And it's called PowerLooking, and this is our virtual version of it. But before I go in, I would like to just disclose that I have a financial interest or affiliation with this organization, specifically NDX, who's offering financial support for the content, related to the content of my continuing education presentation in the form of an honorarium. So I do have to disclose that for your continuing education credits. And then also in the more general sense, I do lecture and test or receive materials from the following companies, and they include BioClear, Cosmonent, as well as 3M. So today, with such a short time available, I would like to just kind of streamline my focus as best we can. And what I wanted to do was, as I said, this was a longer course. Typically, this portion is about 3.5 hours. So what I wanted to do was just kind of consolidate from the, I guess, feedback from other attendees and the parts that they thought was the most salient, at least in the respect to working with the dental laboratory. Now, a lot of the programs that I do, I'm teaching direct composite. So you'll see some elements of that here. But my focus really was going to be on how best can we include our smile design concepts and do it in terms of working with our partner laboratories. So in other words, you're going to hear Mr. Urban's name being mentioned here. That's Dennis, who introduced me. And there'll be a lot of probably back and forth towards the end, because it is definitely a synergistic relationship. So I really wanted to focus the aspects of what we're going to do today sort of within the prism of working with the dental laboratory. So we're going to talk first about smile design with some emphasis on proportionality, shape, color, and a bit of texture. And then in terms of laboratory communication, we're going to talk about shade selection and the options that are available to you and what's preferred in general by your dental laboratory. The thing I did want to add that may make this a little bit interesting is that I'm looking at this not only from the perspective of a clinician, I'm a general dentist, but I'm also a lab owner of a CAD/CAM lab. So having clients and seeing the work of other dentists, it's interesting why sometimes we do the things that we do. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. And then just one point I thought would be kind of fun, because it's something that some people may feel very interested and passionate about, and some may want to let the laboratory do this, but that's about using the intraoral mock-up as a way to help influence your outcomes, as a way to help guide your patient, or as a way to get feedback from your patient, and to help, again, the dental technician. So let's start, excuse me, rather. Let's start at the most sort of basic aspect of smile design. And one of the things we wrote in the course description is, what is an aesthetic smile? And probably I'm going to change that statement, because I think as dentists, as clinicians, and as lab technicians, we, at this point, I think, have a fairly good idea of what a good smile is versus a very ugly smile. But sometimes it helps, I find, to calibrate ourselves a little bit to see what are those little elements, what are the little tips or tricks we can use within the realm of smile design to kind of make our outcomes come out a little bit better. So we'll start with here. This is a case done by a quite prominent laboratory technician in New York. And, there's a wax up, and this is the ubiquitous wax up, I guess, that we get from our technicians. And what makes something like this look like a beautiful smile or a beautiful setup? Well, as clinicians, we're tasked, and technicians as well, we're tasked with replicating nature. We're given materials like feldspathic porcelain or zirconia in some cases, and we're asked by the patient to mimic what they have, right? Sometimes the best compliment, I think, that you can get is if you do a filling or if you do a crown or a veneer on a patient and they say, oh, I forgot it was even there, or it looks just like my old tooth, right? It's like if nothing happened. So we're using inorganic materials or a combination of organic and inorganic materials to replicate natural organic materials. So when we talk about mimicking nature, essentially there's several elements we can use and several criteria. But I think if you distill it to these four sort of categories, I think you'll get a very broad understanding. And when we talk about biomimicry, I would like to talk about proportionality, represented here by the Greek letter phi, which is the symbol for golden proportions, shape, color, and texture. And when we're talking about texture, it's not just the texture of the teeth themselves, but also of the surrounding and adjacent tissue. So let's start here at the most basic sort of entryway. And this is something we're all taught when we're doing our first wax-ups in the anterior. And we're taught about the golden rule, the golden ratio, not the golden rule, but rather the golden ratio or golden proportions. And we see this. Now we see the golden ratio in many places in nature, right? We see it in the sunflower seed. We see it in the nautilus shell. For those who are fans of mathematics, we see it in things like the Fibonacci sequence. And it has been bandied about as a point in the dental literature for some time. But there was a really great article that came out by Levin in '78 in the Journal of Prosthetic Dentistry, where he really applied the principles of golden proportionality to dentistry. And I know we all know this, but just to reiterate, essentially what's done is you take a point, and in this case, he chose the lateral incisor and said, we'll assign the width of the lateral incisor a ratio of 1. And if we look at the central incisor, we want it to be a little bit more than 1.5 times the width of the lateral. And then if we come over to the canine, we want the canine, the width of the canine, to be a little bit more than half the width of the lateral. And one of the things we know about golden proportions is that it doesn't exist in an absolute in dentistry, because we've seen some beautiful smiles that are not necessarily exactly in golden proportions. But what it does for us is it certainly serves as a scaffolding for our smile designs, right? It's a starting point. Now, this is where I'm going to be a little bit particular about the definition, and it's based on this width ratio, but as seen from a direct frontal view. And I'm going to show you one of the biggest, I don't want to call them mistakes, but one of the biggest things in need of addressing when my students had done their anterior provisionals. And I'll show you that it's exactly from not seeing it from a direct frontal view. So another point about the height to width ratio comes to us from authors like Chu that suggested that the width of the maxillary incisors should be approximately 80% of their height. And that means essentially if you have a incisor that's 10 millimeters tall, we expect the width to be somewhere around 8 millimeters. Now, while golden proportions is certainly I don't want to say variable, because it does give us things like central dominance, we don't have to follow it exactly. You can be off 0.1 on one of the ratios. But where I think a smile design is absolutely critical is in this point, and that's in terms of shape. And that is that the central incisors should be twins. And I guess even more specifically, they should be mirror images of each other. And I love this quote by the French physicist Blaise Pascal. Talks about symmetry. And he says, symmetry is what we see at a glance based on the fact that there is no reason for any difference. And this is true, and this is something we're taught to do when we're doing something as simple but as critical as an extraoral or intraoral exam. You know, you're examining the patient and maybe on the left side, you see something red or white and raised or indurated. And the first instinct, I know my first instinct is to check, oh, is there something else on the other side, right? Because often asymmetry can be a sign of something as serious as pathology. So we're very hardwired, I think, and there have been actually animal studies to show this, particularly with primates, about mate selection and symmetry. So I think a lot of symmetry is actually hardwired into us from a survival point of view. And that's why I think it's so important that those central incisors are exactly, or as close as exactly can get, to mirror images as they can be. Now, is that as important for the laterals? Well, the laterals don't have to be mirror images. You don't need them to be twins, but we want them to look like they're at least related, or else they can throw the disharmony of a smile. So an example like this was a case that was restored with two lithium disilicate veneers on 8 and 9. And you can see, I think the technician did a beautiful job of creating some symmetry. And the patient, I think, has a very nice smile, even though the laterals aren't exactly twins. The closer we get to the midline, the more important the symmetry. And does this apply to the maxilla? You know, it's always nice. This was a case we did in direct composite right as the pandemic started. Lockdown made a lot of kids very ornery and bouncy. And you know, she came in, this young lady, and we repaired her DILF on tooth number 24. And I mean, is it as critical? And I would argue probably not, but I think it's absolutely essential in the maxilla. It's a good guide, and that's really what it is. It's about being a good guide in the anterior, in the maxillary. So I spoke earlier, I spoke a bit about the importance of symmetry the closer you get to the midline. So this was just an example of a patient who was about to get married, and she has some perio issues, among other things. And she was the fiance, now the wife, of a good friend of mine from my baseball team. And he said, you know, Doc, can you do something with my wife's teeth? I said, sure, but she's going to need some perio surgery. You know, when is the wedding? And I'm thinking I have nothing but time here. And of course, I don't have much time because they're getting married in less than 2 weeks. So I tell her, listen, let's opt for just single shade composite veneer so that we can help hold your smile for the photographs. And then you have to come back and do all your work. So I just want to point this area here, and that's this area contained within the bubble. And this is something that I like to deem the critical zone. And about a year and a half ago, maybe a year and a quarter ago, we published an article on the midline critical zone as an aesthetic shape determinant. And essentially, it's 4 areas that every time I'm looking at a smile, if it's a natural smile, if it's a smile we're going to restore with direct composite, or if the technician and I are going to collaborate to make an indirect restorations, we always would like to assess this area. And it's essentially made up of 4 different aspects. And the first thing is that the midline critical zone is what sets our horizontal and vertical cant. And we see this because all of us, whether we're technicians here or we're dentists or even dental students, does everyone remember setting teeth in dental school, right? And what's the first 2 teeth you set up? Always the maxillary incisors. So you place 8 and 9, and then you do 7 and 10, and you follow outwards. Have you ever had this situation where you maybe place the teeth, come back, and you look at your wax up, and then you look at it and you go, and everything's kind of turned? I mean, I've certainly had that heartbreak a few times in dental school. But that's the thing. If the central incisors are not set appropriately, the smile is damaged irreversibly. It's not something you can repair. You have to redo the smile. It also includes our incisal embrasure. I'm going to show you the thing that happened to me and my students. It includes that in this midline critical zone. It also, when looking at the teeth with a patient mirror, or not a examine mirror, from the facial, you can see the facial embrasure. And then finally, if you see these areas, I'll go back in purple, you see that light reflectance. And this is really our light reflective zone, but anatomically, it's the light reflecting from the mesiofacial line angle. And so the whole game, as I see it, is to not only make sure I look like mirror images, but I really want to make sure that midline critical zone is as close to perfect as I can get it. So these are the two veneers we did on her. And by the way, I don't nail it all a lot, but it's something I'm striving for. So we look at our midline critical zone here, just simple one shade, just quick polish, composite veneers. But you can see getting that mesiofacial line angle, getting our incisal embrasure, getting our proper horizontal and vertical cant makes the smile certainly look more harmonious than if we didn't, right? And so what if you have a situation like this, young boy's first appointment at the office, and he has to come in because he has a fracture of this number 8. And, yes, we can, and tested vital. And we can say, well, would you tell the mother, listen, I'm sorry, little Johnny decided to take, a header into the concrete, but I'm going to take an impression of this. And then I'm going to send it to the laboratory. And then they're going to make a wax. The moms don't necessarily want to hear this. Is there something we can do to provide immediacy? And yes, with CAD/CAM materials, we can do this in the office, or we can do this directly. And so by looking at the adjacent teeth, we were able to use the adjacent tooth as a guide to help restore the fractured portion and try to mimic that as best we can. So when we look at the critical zone, you can see it's not exactly perfect, but it certainly helped establish where I wanted to go with the restoration. So I think for me, this midline critical zone really sets everything off. Now, if it was in the lateral, I certainly had more leeway because I'm not beholden to this principle of the mirror images. But if I'm doing any time between 8 and 9, it's absolutely critical that you nail this area, in my opinion. But like I said, it doesn't always happen. Here's an example of a case with direct composite. This was a 17-year-old boy, was swimming. And a week before his high school graduation, he took one extra stroke and he ended up with a fractured of mesial incisal lingual aspect of tooth number 9. So I said, I'd like to try fixing these. This was pretty early in my career. Came in and I went before and I'm after. And now the thing is, when I was working on this case, I thought I had absolutely 100% created the most symmetrical 2 teeth that I had ever done in my life. And I don't know what magic happens when that patient goes from sitting back in the chair to sitting up. It's almost like the wind comes out of your sails, right? I looked and it was almost like is that the same tooth? Because if you look here, yes, it's a serviceable option, but it's not exactly a mirror image. And I was absolutely certain that I got a mirror image, right? And okay, understand I use the polychromatic approach and there's some issues with the color. So what if I take color out? And I can't blame the color on why I'm asymmetrical. Why did this happen? And then very simply, the reason this happened was because when I was working on the patient, where I was working on the patient created a parallax. Now, for the parallax is a very, very simple thing, but it's best illustrated by these 2 pictures. The first photo on the left is a gas gauge. And on the first photo, from looking at it from the side, it looks about 3/4 full. But when you look at it directly head on, you can see it's about 7/8 full. And so this is literally a visual parallax, but it can create something for us, especially because we work in such small areas that can really negatively sometimes impact our outcomes. So what is a parallax? And the parallax is just an alteration in an object's apparent position or shape relative to where the observer is looking at it, the observer's perspective. And this happens from an improper operator perspective when you're doing your evaluation. And this is subject to a left and a right-hand bias. And here's what I mean. In dental school, if you looked at your patient like on a clock, they told us if the patient is sitting at the 6 o'clock position, you want to work with the patient at the 12 o'clock. And that's great. The problem is I need an assistant. And sometimes it's difficult to sit at the 12 o'clock. So often I'm working as a right-handed operator somewhere around the 10 or 11 o'clock position with my assistant at the 1 or 2 o'clock. The problem is this can create a right-hand positional bias. And of course, to no surprise for left-handed clinicians, sitting at the 1 or 2 o'clock position can create a left-hand positional bias. And this is actually a lot more common than you would think. So the optimal operator position, in my opinion, is to go face-to-face. Maybe not this close unless you really know the patient, but getting directly in front of the patient, sitting them up and looking directly at the patient offers us some advantages. The first one is that it'll allow for an assessment of the incisal edge position and length. Secondly, it'll allow for the adjustment of incisal embrasures. Now, the first point is particularly important if you're doing freehand provisionals. And we'll talk about a little bit about doing freehand provisionals. Also, it lets you assess the lip drape of the patient. And this was something that was discussed very nicely by orthodontists such as Vince Kokich, and I believe his son, if I'm not mistaken, at the Spear Group. And so this is a very good way for us to, especially if we're freehanding it without a stent or a wax up, to adjust our desired shapes and tooth sizes. So if we look at the case I did, look at where my incisal embrasure is pointing. And I said, when I was sitting there, it looked perfect. And yes, sitting at the 10 or 11 o'clock, this would look good, but it's wrong. It creates a parallax. Right? I should have been sitting straight up and down. And again, I'm not the only one who does it because I paid good money for this wax up. And as you can see, even the technician that did it was probably sitting, waxing up slightly behind it, perhaps looking at it from a 10 or 11 o'clock position. So just be aware that it's a small point, but looking dead ahead, especially when you're doing a lot of anterior provisionals, crowns, or veneers, it'll definitely make your assessment so much easier. And also, to be fair, look what also happens to your axial inclinations if you're sitting at an improper orientation. Look, all of them for the most part, maybe 10 a little bit less, but you can see I've created a cant to my preparations. And this was maybe 1 or 2 years out of school for me. So, you know, I hope I've learned since then. And I hope if you're a dental student, welcome. And I hope, or you're a resident or a young dentist, you know, avoid the mistakes that we made. And trust me, you don't want to go through that nonsense again. And sometimes it can be even more than that. Have a look at this case. This was a case I inherited where the patient didn't like the way her teeth were biting. Well, you just had to take one step back, and it's not too hard to see that, again, having this improper axial orientation can really negatively impact your outcomes, right? And that's the orientation we have here. Anyway, just wanted to discuss that. So now that we're calibrated, and that was on good timing, I do want to talk a little bit about ways we can be a little bit more precise with our technicians. And if you're a technician listening, obviously, you know a lot of the shape guidelines as well, but how can we best be collaborative? I mean, NDX is a phenomenal laboratory and organization, and they're dedicated to ensuring that we get the best outcomes and the best collaborative efforts between our clinicians and our technicians, and ultimately our patients. And of course, so you have to throw in your specialists. But what's the issue often? The issue is, right, we'll have a case like this. Patient comes in, wants to redo her smile. You know, we're done and we see something like this, and we take if you're still doing impressions, you'll take an impression and you give your laboratory something like this and you say, hey, dear lab, make me teeth. Now, just as a small plug, there is available on the NDX website, a website for free on material selection. And Dr. and Mr. Urban and I are, I believe, on that webinar, and it goes through all of your options. So we won't cover that in detail today, but just know that it is there. But the point is, you know, how do we pick the best materials? How do we let the laboratory know what we need to get the outcome that we're looking for? So I think the most important, and I think Dennis would agree with me, thing we can do is give the technician as much information as we can. You know, as clinicians, we have an advantage and a disadvantage. We have an advantage because we're invested in the patient directly. And that can be an advantage if we want to do some adjustments. But we have to remember that, of course, the technicians are working on their bench and they're maybe looking at a photograph or two, if we're lucky. And dentists will tell you, we don't always get photos. I can tell you that as a lab consultant from a decade ago, as well as a lab owner now, we don't always get pictures. And so pictures make things easier. The addition of digital dentistry certainly has helped a ton, at least on our end. But it's still a good idea to convey as much information to your laboratory as possible. So when it comes to shade selection, we want to talk a little bit about color. And I'm going to make this kind of brief, but I think it's, especially for some of you younger doctors, it can be helpful to think of color this way. Because when we're talking about color, really what we're talking about is choices. So you can be like my son when he was small, and you can just simply choose all the colors. Or you can be like some of the more seasoned docs who remembered when life was easy, when everything was one color, right? It was the Henry Ford principle, except in dentistry was you can have any colored tooth you want, so long as it's gold. But now with the advent of materials like lithium disilicate and its derivations and zirconia, there's a lot more there. And again, in the webinar, we go over even how to tackle discolored dentition. But what I want to focus on is color and how we can best give the information to our technicians. So what are the determinants of color? Well, there's three. We have hue, chroma, and value. And I don't want to make it too drawn out, so I'm going to go kind of quickly, but I want to show you why it's important to give each type of photograph, because we're going to talk about photography, to your technician. So let's start with hue. You know, hue is am I looking at a jelly bean that's red? Is it green? Is it purple? To be fair, in dentistry, this is probably the least impactful, but it is still important because we have areas where adding things like hue, maybe via staining, can provide us some more depth or realism. So for example, this is a class 2 restoration I did on my wife's cousin some years ago, and you can see she had some pretty prominent staining. Would I have made the restoration look nicer by adding some staining in this area, and the outline in blue is my restoration? So would it provide more depth of realism? Like, for example, this is a case. I did a pretty big occlusal on tooth number 15, but on tooth number 14, the patient had these existing occlusal composites. They were smooth, closed, what my wife likes to say, occlusion, contacts, and margins. Everything looked good. Does it make it look realistic compared to, maybe I should say it this way, was it worth adding hue to a second molar? And that's just something to consider. It's absolutely an artistic endeavor. It doesn't help really with the longevity of the restoration any more than doing it in a single color. But if you feel that sort of artistically, then more power to you. There's no weakness to do that. But is it necessary? Well, I would argue in the posterior, yeah, this is a little bit cute to try to do something like this because nobody's going to see it. But what about a case like this? Patient comes in and they have an existing, and I mean existing as in this is less than 2 weeks old, this facial restoration on number 8, as you can see here. And the shade, for the most part, was not bad. I think the base shade was okay. I think the issue was that we had to add some hue. So when we redid this restoration here, I added about 2 colors, extra colors, 3 technically with a little tint. So we added something like white opaque, and it's held up very well even after the rehydration, because these are obviously dehydrated from rubber dam use. But you can see that by adding hue, sometimes in the anterior, it is beneficial. But when we're selecting a shade, hue, I think, is one of the least important. But don't underscore hue. Chroma is a good one because chroma is very simple. Chroma is just the amount of saturation of a color, meaning a highly saturated color like the one we see on the left-hand side of the screen is like very red, whereas the one on the right side, the desaturated, is kind of, that looks almost diluted. And that's what it is. It's the amount of color saturation. And you know, we'll see this in dentistry. I'll show you how we can show that to our technicians. The thing is, we sometimes worry about color choices, hue and chroma, when really a lot of the drama is going to be found in the shades of gray, like my daughter here, crying over nothing. But, you know, I'll take her now than as a 14-year-old. I'm just saying, if any of you have teenagers, whoo. But the drama, oh, you know, looking at this, maybe it's a bad idea to put a picture of my daughter with the phrase shades of gray. I have to think that one over. But the drama is really in the gray. And by gray, I'm talking about the value. And the value is simply a measure of the grayscale. It's the measure of the inherent lightness or darkness of a material. We use value a lot, and your technicians will use it for the evaluation of incisal translucency, because we know that enamel is a modulator of value, and I'll show you an example of that. And the other thing is, a lot of the shade guides that you own, they are value-based shade guides. So incorporating gray in black and white photography actually can be very helpful. One of the theories is, because we have 6 times more rods than cones, and rods do our black and white vision, cones do our color vision, is that we are sometimes more acute in seeing discrepancies in grayscale. So if some of you are not very good at doing color shade taking, I'll show you the photographs that the labs want and why sometimes taking it in black and white can be more useful for you, especially if you're colorblind as well. But let me show you what I like to call a functional relationship. This is not an absolute true. I say it's like 98% of the time accurate. But in dentistry, I think it's absolutely correct. And that is the functional relationship between value and chroma. And simply as the chroma increases, your value will decrease. In other words, as your saturation increases, it gets darker. Conversely, as your chroma decreases, your value will now start to increase. And here's what the relationship between your chroma and your value look like. They're the same photograph or the same picture. All I did was I took the first photograph, which you've seen before, and I copied it into grayscale. And as we look, the more saturated areas tend to be darker, and the more or less saturated or desaturated areas tend to have a higher value. And how does this impact us directly in dentistry? Well, here's my model of a tooth. And we know that at the cervical region, the enamel tends to be quite thin. Because the enamel is thin, you get a lot of chroma from the underlying dentin. And then somewhere in the middle, we have our intermediate enamel. We have this medium chroma, our body shade. And at our incisal edge, histologically and functionally, we have this thick enamel, which tends to have a lower chroma. And if we are now to look at the enamel, and then we take the same photo of picture I had, convert it to grayscale again, our thin enamel gives us a lower value, somewhere in the middle. And by the way, this intermediate region, this is where, and I think all of you know this, if you're doing a shade selection, you should look towards the middle of the tooth. And again, for that same reason, it's kind of an intermediate value between your enamel thickness and your underlying dentin showing through. And then at the incisal edge, we have thicker enamel giving us a higher value. And this is just one funny example, which never do this. I don't know why I thought this was the right way to do things, but this is what experience gives you. This was a patient who presented with this endodontically treated number 25. So we said, we'll do a crown here. So I tried to keep my preparation as equal and as uniform as possible. And definitely, I believe, in my opinion, this is not only over prepared, I think it's also over treated, where I think this would be one I would look at internal bleaching today, without question. However, if you look back at the previous slide, you saw there was variation in color. When we look at the enamel, maybe in the half the tooth because of the dentin, notice the dentin, for the most part, tends to be fairly uniform in its color. Endodontically treated teeth, you'll have some variations, but we saw all this different gradation of color on the lower incisor, and it was really due to the influence and thickness of the enamel. So again, enamel is that modulator of value. So let's talk about what we want to give the laboratory, and we'll move on to our next topics. And the next thing I want to talk about is about which photographs do we want to give to our technicians. And for me and Dennis, if you want to jump in here and say, to me, this is probably one of the most important photographs you can give your technician. And that is, you're going to place at least 3 shade tabs are placed in the same plane as the prepared teeth. And why is that important? Because if you put the shade tab too far forward, it'll be lighter than the actual color. And if you stick it like by the patient's uvula, you're going to end up with a darker. So I tell the assistants, try to line it onto the incisal edge of the upper teeth. When you take this photograph, this is going to be one of the dumbest comments I'm going to say, but I will tell you this just happened to me with my own associate last week or 2 weeks ago before the whole COVID thing. He's had a picture and sent it to us so that we could do a shade assessment. And do you see that it says B1, A1, and A2? He sent us a photograph that literally had just the 3 shade tabs. Oh, I'm so proud of you. You gave me the shade tabs. The problem is I can't read it. And so because I can't read it, I don't know what each color is. So I always joke, I say, don't forget to take the name of the shade. And he was like, oh, don't worry, it'll never happen again. And sure enough, it happened. So yep. It can happen. Dennis, am I wrong?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, Dr. Volker, many times in the laboratory, we get pictures of shade selections with the thumb over the actual shade. So we said, well, what are we doing here? What are we matching? But right. I wanted to comment too, many of the surveys that have been done, the third or fourth reason for remakes, the most remakes in laboratories is shade. Number one is impressions, but the third or fourth is shade selection. So it's so important to get that shade selection accurately.
And it's so easy. And by the way, I'm shooting, you saw my setup. I didn't go into it. I want to try to keep us a little bit on track for time. But what Dennis said is, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times we've had issues with poor reporting of shade. And it is the easiest thing in the world to do. So what I was going to say was, you saw my camera setup. And if anyone has any questions at all on cameras and stuff, I'm happy to answer. But you don't need to have a big setup. Though I think the way to get better is definitely to just take as much photography with a big, nice, long lens as you can. I'm using a 100mm lens. I like Canons, but Nikons, obviously, and Sony's and others are beautiful cameras. But even if you're going to take this with a cell phone, it's absolutely fine, because this is what you're looking at. You're not looking at an absolute. What you're looking at what B1, A1, and A2 look like relative to each other. The things, this is not one of those absolutes. So if you use, you can use a Polaroid camera, it'll work. Actually, probably works better, but you don't need fancy equipment. You just have to show the shade tab so that the technician can say, now I can compare what A1 looks like from this exposure and these camera settings. Oh, this is what A2 looks like. So you want to put those 3 shade tabs in the same plane. You don't have to put the likely shade in the middle. That's not necessary. But this also, by the way, will let the lab see the preparations of the teeth, the adjacent, and of the ones you're looking for, so long as you put the names. And I don't want to ask Dennis, but hey, Dennis, have you ever had clients not only put their thumb over the guide, have they just given it to you with the name cropped out?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. So, yeah. And we'd love to do, especially on all ceramic restorations on the aesthetic zone. And we have an adjacent tooth. Like, say we're going to be doing number 9 and taking a shade on number 8. We want to get at least 3 shades, the cervical, the mid-range, midsection of the tooth, and the incisal of the tooth. So this helps us when we're building up our porcelain and restorations also, and it helps with accuracy. So.
And that's the thing. And it's easy. There's no excuse not to do it. It takes 2 seconds with a cell phone. You can have your patient take the photo if you want and have them email it to you. I think there's no excuse for this. But the other thing I would suggest is you have that photo I just described. Then take the same photograph, and I want you to convert it to grayscale. Because I think if some of you looked at your color and your black and white, I think you may be able to do a better job discerning the shade in grayscale, in black and white. And it helps. And this is more points of information. Now, if you really have OCD, and we all know that you can't spell dentist without OCD, you can go for a third one. Whereas the other 2 photographs I showed you were the same picture with a software adjustment. These 2 are actually 2 completely different photographs. I don't know how I cropped them so evenly, but they're not the same photograph. But what you're looking at is a regular photograph on the left, and on the right, we have a polarized photograph. And in the difference, you can see that polarized photographs, and here's another example, and I'm using Polarize from Photomed. It's essentially just a polarized filter. But what it does do is it removes specular highlights. So sometimes remove a lot of the influence from like light reflecting back. So if you're using a ring flash or a twin flash or a twin flash with pocket bouncers, doesn't matter. It takes out every aspect of the color of the, of the light reflectance. So it gives the laboratory more information. So typically on a case, if it's especially a big anterior case, I'll use color, grayscale, and a polarized shot. So the first two are the same photograph, just with software manipulation. And the third one is with the polarized filter. And again, this is much more information. Now your technician is really has an idea of what's going on in terms of the shade and the shape of the shade of the teeth. Now, the polarized filter costs about $500, $600, and dentists, a universal rule is that we're quite frugal. So one suggestion you can do is you can do a software manipulation. On a lot of the phones and on your softwares, they'll say something that says saturated, and all you do is increase the color saturation. You increase the chroma of the photograph. So these two are the same photo, just with a software manipulation. So this is a good way, I think, to help give that information in terms of the saturation of color now to your laboratory. So you're giving them information on the chroma, you're giving them information on the grayscale and the regular, in other words, non-saturated. And again, the more data you can give us, the more successful I believe your outcome can be. And I just give you I'm trying to throw some funny examples, and then we'll go to the last section. Excuse me. But this is an example of, I know a lot of dentists, and I throw this in there because I teach direct composite. I teach fractures, full mouth rehabs with direct composite for veneers. So I'm very much love that aspect of dentistry. And I teach it, and then some people, especially my students, if they're not into it, they kind of like lose interest, which I understand. But there's times when I think it can be very helpful. And this is one such example. This was a patient came in, older woman came in, fell down, and she fell down and broke her crown, like the old saying goes. And her crown actually fell out. She couldn't find it. Luckily, her tooth was intact. That's not a fracture, that's cement. It was the oddest thing. She fell down, she was okay. But it really threw her confidence that she had fractured her tooth. She felt like she was almost disfigured, she said. So can we do anything? And I said, well, I don't have anything, right? But I do. And what I had these preformed crowns. And what if anything I'm showing today strikes an interest, then I would just like to throw out that maybe you might want to consider getting liquid tints, because you can use liquid tints not only for your direct composite, but you can use it for your indirect, and sometimes can help your laboratory. So you can use your liquid tints, you can use a small brush, you can use a probe. And in this case, well, I'll show you in a second, but the tints that are available is you can use something like a gray or a violet or a blue tint to help simulate your incisal translucency. And just like a lab technician, you can use white or some shade opaque at your incisal edge to create a halo. You can also use white to create like maverick effects, hypocalcifications, like I showed you in one of the direct cases with the person who had that filling that was just recently done. So in this case, we used a prefab crown. I put a little score mark, as you see in the second photo, and I started placing some tints. And, not that we got something fantastic for the patient, but definitely it was serviceable. And it only took us a few minutes to accomplish something like this. A little bit of gray, some ochre, but it's just becoming comfortable with taking photographs, with looking at it, analyzing it. So for you younger doctors, and for those of us with the experience as well, it's an endeavor. If you are interested in doing it, it's certainly a passion play more than it will certainly, this is not something that was going to be as profitable as if I took out number 8 and placed an implant. But for me, it's kind of a satisfied feeling internally. And I'm glad I'm speaking at a lab, because the technicians listening are probably like, yeah, I get it. But I know there's a dentist there that's like, dang it, you should have just done an implant. But anyway. So let me go now to the last portion. It's a little, not longer, but it's what I want to just discuss about how we can more directly influence some of our treatments, right? Because one of the things that we're taught, and I don't want the technicians to feel like we're going after their work, because believe me, we can't do what they do. But what I was taught as a student, and this was something from when I was a dental student, was, get comfortable with practicing. If you like to do aesthetics, to try to do your own wax-ups or your mock-ups. So I remember my mentor, this is such an old case, but I still like it because it was one of the first ones where he said, just go put composite on the model and try to make something look good. You know, it's always we were always felt whatever the lab is going to give you, that's what you have to work with. And ultimately the lab will give you the aesthetics, but you have to work together. The longer I'm doing this, the more I certainly see that you cannot get a good result without synergy. You really can't. So I want to talk a little bit about this intraoral mock-up. It's basically a way to use some composite, and instead of doing the mock-up on the model or on the screen if you're doing digital like we are now, but this is the most directly impactful way of showing the patient, I believe, what's possible. Then I'm going to show you just 3 quick cases about how we can do that. So when we're doing the intraoral mock-up, it's cheap and it's fast, which dentists love because we're cheap or frugal. So I'm going to start first with the armamentarium. So it's basically just 5 things. The first thing is expired composite. Maybe. You know, it's funny because they used to say, oh, just give me whatever expired composite, because you're going to actually place this, as you'll see, on the patient's teeth. So if you have a lot of D4, maybe let that D4 go to the D4 graveyard. I would suggest if you're going to do a mock-up on the patient, maybe do it with the same shade or something slightly lighter. Don't all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, I had all this, you know, C4, I have to use it up. So I still try to use expired composite because it's only going to be on the teeth for a short time. A thin bladed instrument, this is what's called an IPCL from Cosmodent. A number 3 sable brush. And then I'm going to just use a coarse disc and just finally some liquid glaze for polish. And the protocol is as follows. You just dry the teeth really well. Don't put any etch, don't put any bond. And you're going to take a bit of composite and you place it on with finger pressure. You basically build a quick primary shape with just your fingers. You make the gingival areas a little bit thicker to facilitate removal. And then once you've cured everything, to get a better shape, you're going to quickly go with a coarse sandpaper disc. Then once you have the shape that you want, and this is not, we're not trying to create pericomata or some tertiary anatomy. We just want to give the patient a primary, hey, look, this is what we're proposing. So we'll just use some composite glaze or bonding agent, which is expensive. Just use composite glaze or those provisional polishers. And then what I do is I tell the patient, I want you to take the photographs. So they'll take selfies. They'll say, listen, take this selfie before we start. Remember where your hand is. I'll keep the light in the same place. Then when we finish, take the selfie in the same one, because now the patient can look at their smile. You see all my pictures, I have teeth this big. Patients don't know what that means. They want to see the smile in the context of their face. So the most important thing I can do here for the patient is let them take some, go to the bathroom, take some before pictures. I'll finish, go to the bathroom again, stand by the light, stand in the waiting room, get as many smile photos for the patient. So when they go home, they can assess and give you their feedback. And if they're interested or they like it, I would tell you absolutely take an impression then or a stent. Even if you do not love your mock-up, it's a great way to start with your technician. So very briefly, patient comes in, you can see the axial orientation is a bit off. Can we do something? So we just very quickly did 2 composites, and we can say, look, this is where I think your teeth can look if you're not going to do ortho first. You know, we can do an analysis of their proportions if we want to, right? Always keeping in mind we're trying to create those twins. And you see the glaze that you get? It's just simply from that liquid glaze. I do not like liquid glazes as a long-term or even maybe a medium-term solution on my provisionals. They always come off, they gunk, and they turn yellow. If you want to get a highly polished provisional, polish it in the way that you would a composite is my input. Dennis, is there any, do you think doing a mock-up is a good idea as this video plays? I'm just going to show you quickly with a video about how it looks like using the mock-up. I'll wait for Dennis. You take a little blob of composite, just like I'm doing here. just using my thumb, and I hope that comes in through. If it's not very clear, I'll have it sent to the editor, the video editor, and they'll make it play. Sometimes playbacks on Zoom are not really, they're very choppy. So by the way, so I placed the composite. This is the IPCL. That's the very thin. You see how thin it is, really allow you to go into proximally. So I'm just going in there trying to get kind of a quick shape. Now I will do this much faster in the mouth. I'm just doing it slow for demonstration purposes. And then I'll take a little bit of the wetting agent and I will go with my number 3 brush. That's my sable brush. And I'll just adapt it, cure it, get the first one done, go to the second one and do the same. Let's see if I can move it up a little bit faster here. Okay, so now I'm coming in here. Let me just go a little faster so I can show you. Sorry, let me go back. So I'm placing it, just trying to get that shape. I'll go ahead and cure it once I get the shape of the second one. It's repeated the same way. I want to show you using the coarse disc. And I'm just trying to get my anatomy. Now I'm also trying to be very careful to get my lingual anatomy, because if I've got my bite correct, I may have saved my lab technician a bunch of headache from trying to get a occlusion figured out. Sometimes, where's the best articulator you hear? Between the patient's ears, right? Kind of thing. Yeah. So once we're done with the primary shape, we'll just place that glaze on. And I'll let the whole video be part of the presentation for playback, but just for the sake of time, because I want to get to the cases. And basically we have something like this. You see how nicely it polishes? And you just go ahead and cure it. And now you've given the patient a change. And you can see we've changed the axial inclination. Right there is very important. Get that lingual surface smooth for the patient. And then we cure it and we end up with our final restorations.
Very nice. I mean, this goes a long way, doing something like this and having the patient look at it right there and then. One of the things that we used to do also is the doctor used to take an Elgin impression of the patient who's possibly interested in doing changing their anterior teeth or getting veneers, and we would do a wax up and on a model, and we'd make a putty index on the model. Then go into the office and put some composite in the putty index and go over their teeth. Put some petroleum jelly over the teeth. Put the composite over there in the putty index, take it off, and they would have all their teeth. It could be 6 anteriors or all the teeth, and they could see, wow, this is great. Once I get these veneers or whatever I'm going to be whatever kind of restoration I'm going to be getting, that's going to look great. So yeah, it's a little more expensive, a little more time consuming also. But
right, and so that's the only thing. This is done. So just for clarity, this is done at the consultation.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah,
it's quick, but it's not. You see, it's not perfect. Like, and here you can talk to your patient about things like, the patient doesn't like her 2 front teeth. But you say, well, maybe if you want to consider adding some there, then it lets them see the smile. What dentist does is we do that. We call it prototyping. And that's after we get the wax up. But this is done even before the prototype comes in, because I'll say, look, this is what I'm thinking. You tell me where you want it changed. I'll tell the technician. When the technician gives me the mock-up, then that prototype should be really honed for the patient. You can do for things like midline corrections. I don't want to too much on that. But what are the advantages of doing it this way? And certainly to what Dennis was talking about, that immediate impact and communication. It lets the patient know immediately, hey, this is something that we can get done, and this is where I'd like to go with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, it's quite thick at the gingiva, but it certainly tells the technician, hey, this is where we want to go with it. Oh, patient, she likes rounder teeth, or actually she likes a little bit square here. She likes that sharper corner. It can save you an appointment on some cases, the smaller ones. You do this quickly, by the way. Each tooth is done, I would say, a minute or less. Maybe the first tooth, 2 minutes, just to establish it. But then once you're done, it should take you about, I think we average about 45 seconds per tooth. And again, this is at the consultation appointment. And here, this is the biggest point for me. It facilitates communication with the patient and the laboratory. Hey, this is where I think we can go with it. So if you feel comfortable doing it, it works. And for me, how many times have you broken provisionals because you didn't watch the occlusion? This helps. This lets the start point for the occlusion in many, many ways. And here's something else you can do, by the way. This is a patient who, and this speaks to sometimes how labs work. You will not have this with NDX, but this was a case done by a lab where one person, this is a 2-unit provisional. The right side is an implant supported provisional, and it was done as a removable. And the right side, the left side, meaning 8 to number 11, number 12, is a one-piece PMMA. So we're looking at an acrylic PMMA on the left side. It was not a removable. It was a regular acrylic done by the removable department. And on the right side, we have another done by the owner of the lab. And you can see that you can definitely tell this was done by two different people. And a patient I tried it in. It looked a little weird, because you get it as two separate parts. And I tried it in and I said, all right, the fit is good, but I don't like the way this looks. So instead of, and again, you can tell the laboratory to change this, but for me, I said, look, I'd rather control this myself. If we look here, do you see the visual disharmony of this case, right? You can see where the smile goes up, it dips. We can especially see it in terms of the axial inclination. So what did I do? Well, I said, well, look, I'm going to take bonding agent. I'm going to put it all over these teeth, and I'm just going to build with direct composite on top of each tooth. So from number 4 to 212, all those anteriors, I just redid it in composite, right? And so this is just freehand. But the thing is, if you do it long enough, you get an idea of what should look good. And if we take a look here, we can see now we get a little bit more harmony. I lengthened the right side a little bit, but you have to understand, I can't put this on the lab. The lab only sees the pictures. The laboratory only sees the models. I'm working with the actual client. So I'm using it as my jump off point, as my canvas. This is a lot easier. The technicians would do a much better job than this if they had the patient there. They don't have that luxury. I do. So this is, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8. How many do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 units of direct composite that I just did for the patient and polished it. And this is polished, by the way. If I put the glaze on, it would come back very, very yellow, in my opinion. Anyway, axial inclination, there we go. So you can use it to adjust your temporaries, and it'll help because I tell you one thing, that smile on the second photograph, that's going to the lab. And I'm going to say, this is what I want. I don't know what we're thinking on the first picture, but I want that as my second photo to be my outcome, right? So if we have time, maybe just 3 quick cases where I think it might help you. This case is actually literally in progress right now, but just to show you how we can maybe do some tricks to help our outcomes with the mock-up, with the direct intraoral. So this is a patient, obviously you can see what's going on between 8 and 9, a retracted view. And she doesn't like the disharmony. So I said, okay, well, let's mock it up. But now we can use the mock-up for 2 things. I can use it to help me make my provisional, but also because I've done all my measurements, and of course we can't ignore the biology, I can use it as my shade for my little perio surgery. And by surgery, I just mean gingivectomy. If it's something bigger, by the way, what I will do is I'll take this photograph, and I'll also do an intraoral scan, and I'll print a 3D model and give it to my periodontist if they're going to do osseous resection. But because we had 4 millimeters, it was very easy to do with gingivectomy. So I did my mock-up for my provisional, did the mock-up for my gingivectomy, and I'm using the intended shade. So I think this was like an A2 or something like that. This is not the same case, but I didn't photograph that case for some reason. And I'm using the operative microscope, so I can take photos very easily. But what you see here is basically a case where I have the mock-up section and ready to be used as a perio guide or as a surgical guide. So I'm confirming my measurements. I place the guide over the teeth I'm going to do the crown lengthening and removal of the PFM. And I'll just punch these little holes with a sharp explorer. Then I'll take off the surgical guide, and I'll come in with either a laser, burrs, scalpel. What else can we use? I know people like to use white stones for gingivectomies. Whatever you feel comfortable doing. I'll go ahead and you can see the dots. Maybe I'll show you here. You can see some of the dotting. And as long as I stay within the dotting, I'll be within my appropriate biological measurements. Then I'll put my guide back. And that's the last picture. It's just a guide simply in place to make sure that I prepared the tissue sufficiently. So in the case I did earlier, or in this single tooth, we did a diode, as you can see by the zone, the healing zone. And, when I'm assessing these provisionals, right, I'm looking at my critical zones always. See, trying to look at my light reflectance. How's my incisal? And we want to progress. So this is where the patient was 2.5, no, that can't be 2.5, 3 days after surgery. And she was doing great. And you can see she told us she was much happier. You know, is the provisional perfect? No. Do I expect the lab to do the final outcome much better than any of my provisionals? Yes, of course. But I'm giving the laboratory a guide, and I'm trying to improve the patient's smile with that twinning of the central incisors. So 2 cases, guys, I promise, and then we'll be finished. Dennis, I'm okay on time?
Yeah, we should be fine. Yep.
Okay,
That's good.
it won't be long. I just want to show 2 cases.
No, these cases are great. I love them. So yeah, keep going.
So these last 2 are finished. They're finished cases. So I'll just show you about this. Now here, this is another example of bad communication between your laboratory and the dentist. This is an older case, so I would have done things a little bit differently, but the outcome is something that I just wanted to show. And then I'll answer every question, so please put it in the chat box afterwards. And then the videos or anything like that, I'll give to the editor so you can see them if anyone is interested in learning the intraoral direct mock-up technique. But this was a patient, called him the super because he was actually my super. And, you know, he would walk around the building and he'd say, you know, how's it going? And I was like, what's going on with his tooth? Because when he smiled, it looked like he had 1 tooth, like 1 really bright tooth. And of course, you know, when he smiled, you would see that when he talked, he looked like he had 1 tooth. When he smiled, that tooth was even more pronounced because of the bleeding around it. So I said, you know, let's do something about that. He was very amenable. He was really got into dentistry. I have to say it was a very interesting experience that he was into bleaching his teeth, then he improved his health. And so it was a very good transformation to see how he started taking care of himself. But again, don't underestimate the power of vanity. So anyway, remove that PFM and you can see this tooth was very tapered and things like that. By the way, the color match, to go back, not bad. And we all know that the single central is the hardest tooth to match, but we had a pretty good match here. So the PFM is removed and I hand made my provisionals from the mock-up, and you can see it looks kind of greasy. So I leave this in there for 2 things. Number 1, to show you, always watch that axial inclination. And then secondly, when you guys should, I mean, everybody knows this, but some of my students didn't, to put Vaseline or some separating agent when you cement your crowns, because it facilitates cleanup. And then, you know, we had a good polish on it. So a few weeks later, he's starting to recover, and you can see what a good polish does to the bisacryl. Now, this was done with a bisacryl provisional. And the reason I'm mentioning is that if I had put a liquid glaze on the teeth, and I think this is 6 weeks later, or maybe 5 weeks later, excuse me, it would be very yellow, even more yellow than that. And by the way, the reason my provisional started to look more yellow is because he started bleaching his teeth very aggressively. So here we have our final preparations done. You can see I tried to recontour. I would be much more conservative. I would maybe even do a vertical preparation on this. And those photographs, and even though this case is quite old, still new, put those shades in, convert that color photo to black and white. I was not using polarized here. So if you're interested, you can use the polarized, or you can use a hyperchromatic saturation setting on your software, and that'll work. And so here you look like before and after, but the main picture for me is right here. And how a motivated patient, a fantastic lab, will make life a lot easier for you. And you can see this was a patient who had very poor dental health, really maintained I think it's already 7 years now, and the case still looks beautiful. And this is what you can accomplish. So for the last case, I just want to show you how we incorporate a little bit digital. And then I promise, guys, give me 5 minutes and we'll be done. And then I promise to get everybody's questions to answer. Now, this is another patient came in, and you see she has already this harmony from her smile. So let's do a little bit of an analysis of what we see. Well, the thing that really throws the smile, I think, is that asymmetrical look to those central incisors. She has, and by the way, very healthy patient. And these crowns are not that old. They're just a few years old. So, you know, I mean, I'm not making excuses for anybody, but this is a healthy patient. So we have that marked cant. You can see we have a right to left cant. She has this gingival asymmetry. We have this incisal length discrepancy, and we have some fractured porcelain. So knowing that I'm going to do a little bit of periodontal work, I will do the mock-up directly on the patient's crowns. It's crowns, I'll do it right on top of their gums, as you saw, and on top of the teeth. The key is to make it very dry, and it'll stay. Now, I put this little caution to remind myself, because her teeth were slightly flared forward, I would not use this as my mock-up because the teeth are too thick here. I want her teeth to be thin. And the only drawback to doing the intraoral mock-up, it works the best. If the patient's teeth are recessed lingually a little bit, it's the best, because then everything you're going to do is to build up and build out. If the teeth are already quite thick, or if one tooth is very facial, you have to be careful about that. And so what I'll do is I'll note that to my technician. So this is a case that, even though I'm close, I won't use this as my mock-up. I mean, we certainly see with a patient can see what can be done, right? But what we had to do is have the technician do it. So we did a bit of the periosurgery, the gum lengthening, the crown lengthening with the gingivectomy. Again, keeping within your biological limits. But as you can see, what's here is this is a printed model of the lab's version. I have to be very specific here. It's the printed model of what the lab did to correct the thickness of her existing teeth. So they did it, they made their own mock-up based on where I put the central incisors, and they made everything nice and thin. And then they gave me a printout, a 3D print of the mock-up with the surgical guide in place, which I don't have a photo here. So we did our gingivectomy. Anyway, I finished our surgery. A few weeks later, she came for the impressions, always with those pictures, right? We have our shade selection shot and also the same photograph in gray for the technician, but I don't always give the saturated photo or the polarized photo unless it's like really specific. If I'm doing a rehab like this, then I'm not as concerned because the laboratory will control a lot of the color. So this is what the patient looked like after cementation. And I just want to show you, here's her before. You know, a good lab will make you look really good, but you need to have that planning. So, right, they did the twinning. You can see where we have better incisal edge discrepancy. We have better incisal symmetry. And in fact, I could have done even more. I could have done number 8 had I chosen to, but the patient was happy like this. But just to look at the progression and to show you what's possible if you work hand in hand with a very good lab technician like I was fortunate to do. And if you are all now clients of the NDX family of laboratories, you'll get this type of attention. You'll be able to do things like this because we have very observant, very diligent, very dedicated technicians. So with that, if any of you have any questions or if you have any comments, this is my personal email. If any of those of you who are interested, I'm also on social media. If it's easier for you to reach me there, I'm on Facebook as my name, and then Dr. Art Volker on Instagram.